All right, very good. Fine. Well, today, November 6, 1985, we have the privilege of interviewing Major General Kenneth D. Nichols, whose career has spanned many of the most important scientific and technical developments of the past half-century. So, with these few introductory remarks, General Nichols, will you please proceed?
Okay, Clarence. First, I was born almost 78 years ago on November 13th, 1907, in a little town called West Park, Ohio, which is now a part of Cleveland, Ohio.
Oh, it's now almost a suburb of Cleveland,
It is a part of Cleveland.
Oh, yes.
We were annexed in 1922, I believe it was. My father was in politics in addition to being a contractor. Partly due to the fact he was a contractor, I learned to be interested in engineering. Although he was not an engineer, he did know how to build things. And when I was 5 years old, I would accompany him in his horse and wagon, and we'd go from job to job, and I would sit on the scaffolding with some carpenter or watch a bricklayer, and sometimes if they talked too much to me and delayed their work, I would find when we left, my father would say, "Take your tools with you tonight."
Oh, that's very interesting.
So the men soon learned that they should pay a little attention to me, but not too much.
Yes. Well, that's very interesting background. So you, at a very early age, you were acquainted with the practical realities of getting jobs done.
Also, and building, because we always had a supply of materials at home. My older brother and I took great delight in building things, anywhere from chicken coops for mother or shoot-to-chutes for the kids, or even one case, a boat, although I don't believe we ever launched the boat. I don't know what happened to it. And anyway, that is my very early start in engineering, you might say.
Oh, yes.
And that's one thing I want to emphasize. I'm an engineer, not a scientist. And later, my education, I had a local school, starting out with 4 grades in one school, in one room. In other words, it was a 2-room school, 4 grades up to 8th. By the time I got to the 3rd grade, however, we had 4 rooms, so it was then 2 grades. I skipped the 8th grade and went into high school. And there I first started an academic course, but later shifted to a business. And then when I discovered you needed a little science and chemistry, physics, and more mathematics, why I shifted back and ended up, I think, taking 8 courses instead of 4 to gain admittance to Case School of Applied Science. However, I didn't go to Case. My mother saw Richard Bartholomew in Classmates, and she thought the uniforms looked very pretty at West Point.
Oh, yes.
So when she saw an advertisement in the newspaper by Theodore E. Burton, our congressman, and he was having a competitive examination for West Point, she said, "You apply." Well, I checked enough to find out that West Point had a group. In other words, you could become an engineer by completing West Point, the Corps of Engineers of the Army. However, I knew very little about West Point. Nobody in the family had ever been military, except my grandfather was wounded at the Battle of Shiloh, and I lost one first cousin in World War I. But I knew nothing about the Army. Anyway, I took the examination, and probably because I had worked in high school with I believe he was one of the English teachers, he was trying to get a PhD at Ohio State on intelligence exams. In other words,
yeah, that was early in the
game, and there were all various forms of them at that time.
Yes.
And I was his chief guinea pig. Mm-hmm. In other words, I would take all these examinations, any type he could find, and then I could type, so I prepared the things to send out to various other schools where other kids would take them. And I think at that time I had taken just about every type of intelligence test you could take.
Oh, yes. So what year was that, John?
That was in 1924.
Oh, yes. Well, as a matter of fact, I've interviewed some men from Stanford who knew the Terman, who originated many of the basic tests there in about 1920. Mm-hmm. So you must have been in right on the ground
floor. That's right, out on the ground floor, and there were still various types.
Oh, yeah.
They were trying to correlate them with what happened afterwards. And how did that represent how you did in school?
Oh, yes.
But anyway, one of the main tests for the competitive examination was an intelligence test, and it was just like just as easy as it could be for me because I'd taken so many of them, and I learned later I'd ranked one in that by quite a margin.
Oh, yeah, so that's very
but anyway, at the test, I was a little bit distressed because all the papers indicated Annapolis as U.S. Naval Academy.
Oh, yes.
Well, I thought that wouldn't be too bad if that was what it turned out to be. But instead, I received about 2 weeks later a telegram from Burton stating that he was appointing me to West Point. So when I arrived at West Point, I knew absolutely nothing about the system there or the Army. I was just a young kid, and we made a mistake, a few of us, coming from Ohio in the 20th century. I believe we got off at Albany and then took the day boat down to Newburgh. And about 4 of us made the mistake of wanting to be eager beavers, so we hired a taxi cab to drive down to West Point. We stayed in the old hotel, which is really nice because once I was registered, you couldn't even go near that old hotel as a plebe. But bright and early, we got up and appeared for registration.
Oh, yeah. Let's see, what year was this, 1924?
1925.
1925.
July 1st, 1925. But within 5 minutes, I knew I'd made a mistake. We'd have started double time and pull your chin in, mister. But I didn't mind discipline too much, as we had discipline in our family. I did write my father after about a month. At the rate I was getting demerits, I'd probably be home by September. And just after I'd written that, I learned the first months didn't count.
Oh, yeah. So that was that was very fortunate.
That was very fortunate. But at West Point, I enjoyed life there. Plebe years a little tough, but I enjoyed the discipline, and particularly the study habits they demanded that you follow. That is, you were graded every day in every subject. So you didn't have the idea of cramming for examinations and that type of thing, or a lot of lectures. And some people criticized the West Point system, calling it not teaching, but just the instructors being a referee between the cadet and the book. However, I, having attended later Cornell for 2 years and State University of Iowa for 2 summers, and absentee for that year, and the Technische Hochschule in Berlin, I believe that, having seen what other universities do, that the West Point system has a lot of merit.
Yeah. You feel that you had got a very good grasp of fundamentals.
At West Point, at that time, they gave you a very good fundamental course, which was basically, well, they called a degree, in addition to the normal degree they also gave you another little slip with Bachelor of Science. So it was technically inclined, but broader than most technical universities. In other words, we had a lot more English, history, and on the liberal side.
Oh, yes.
In fact, 4 years at West Point, you cover more than what you would in 4 years at any university. And going to Cornell, I found that the applying study habits learned at West Point, that Cornell was a cinch.
Oh, yes. That's very interesting. Cornell is a very respected university.
I know my roommate and I, whenever there was a prelim, we'd go out and drink beer that evening, where everybody else would be cramming. One instructor, Rickard, I think his name was, in concrete, he had always had the reputation of being rough on engineers that were sent there. In fact, sometimes he would even fail them, but he found they got in a lot of trouble when he did that. Anyway, in my case, I never could get a 70 on any prelim or any test of any kind he gave, and I thought he was very, very unfair. And finally, though, when it came time for the final exam, I went up and looked, and My name wasn't posted, and I went around to see him. He said, "Oh, you exempted the exam." I said, "How the hell did I do that? I hardly passed." He said, "Well, that was the only way I could make you work."
Oh, yes. Well, that's a very interesting remark.
But he always was rough on one or two engineers because he wanted to make them work.
Oh, yes.
So I had a very pleasant time at Cornell and found my wife there.
Well, that's very interesting that comparing those two academic institutions, because Cornell has a wonderful reputation of being a very fine academic institution.
But going on to my career in a more chronological order, because I didn't go directly to Cornell from West Point. That was not the custom then. I graduated fifth in the class, so I had no trouble ranking the Corps of Engineers. And my first duty was in Nicaragua, which, when you consider what's going on down there now, it's interesting to find what goes on in the place. I spent a year in the jungle in the San Juan River.
This is about 1930?
This was 1929 to 31. I graduated in 1929. But we organized a battalion. Part of it, General Groves, or at that time Lieutenant Groves, was commanding of one company from Fort DuPont. I came from Fort Humphreys, now Fort Belvoir, where we had the headquarters and one company, and another company came from Panama. And it formed a unit which we call U.S. Army Engineer Battalion in Nicaragua. But being the junior, I found myself at the extreme end of the line in most cases and spent most of my time down there out in the jungle. However, I believe it was really a great favor, because most of the time I was at least one day walk or boat ride, or at least one day from my next officer in rank. So I had to make decisions, because on many of them you couldn't wait for time to send a messenger into headquarters or try to get your radio to work. In those days, radios didn't always work, to get any kind of a decision. So I learned very early that make one anyway, go ahead and then send in what you've done, and generally you get away with it. Or I had one little difficulty in court-martialing a man to where my CO finally came down and said, technically you've been right. See, I was then called a camp commander, and we were in a little town of San Carlos, and my cook had the habit of getting drunk on payday. And one day I was called by the one policeman in the town that he was murdering or killing one of the girls in a shack down the road. So his first sergeant and I went to rescue her. And I court-martialed him and decided that, of course, all I could give him was fine him 2/3 of 1 month's pay. I couldn't confine him anywhere. I had no jail.
Oh, yeah, so things were rather primitive there.
And, anyway, I then looked up in the court-martial manual, which we'd studied at West Point, and found that you're supposed to have it reviewed. So being camp commander, I found a camp commander could review it, so I reviewed it and sent it on into headquarters. Well, the next time the CO was down the river, he said that technically I was right, but he thought it'd be better if he reviewed it instead of me. I didn't care, because he came out with the same answer. He sustained the sentence, which wasn't much. But at that time started to decide I'd court-martial the man to get rid of him. You could do that in those days in the Army. But my next in command in headquarters, Grenada, decided I was making a mistake, so he sent me another man who was a better cook and took the one I didn't like. And later that cook went over the hill with 2 girls, 2 donkeys, and about $100 worth of mess supplies, plus a part of the mess fund.
Oh, yes.
And the Marines finally caught him. So at least I was right that you had to get rid of the guy.
Yes, well, you knew what his mode of behavior was.
Right, so then in Nicaragua, I also got, after I finally came to headquarters, I was mixed up with the 1931 Managua earthquake.
Oh, yes.
And we had to put out the fire there. We helped the Marines. And I remember the first night we were there, Colonel Sultan and I went up to see the president. He was up on the hill where he had a palace. The rear end of the palace had slid into a volcano crater. He was sitting out in the front lawn. And he asked us, he said, "I don't hear any explosions lately. Have you quit fighting the fire?" See, we were fighting it with dynamite. We had no water.
Oh, yeah.
And we said, "No, we're just in intervals between explosions. We were clearing out one street at a time in order to narrow the fire one block at a time, working from both sides," which we finally succeeded in doing, having it come out to a point where we then held the line. Lieutenant Groves at that time was down at the bottom of a volcano crater trying to get the debris off the waterworks. He succeeded after about a week, but I'm glad he had that job. I'd rather take the chance on dynamiting and working in a fire and
incidentally, that crater. That technique of controlling a fire by dynamiting was also used in San Francisco.
It's always criticized, however.
It is.
However, I was decorated by four others, including Groves and Colonel Sultan and our top medical man, Major Hawley, who later was the top surgical man, medical man for Eisenhower in the invasion of Normandy. But the whole experience, though, although it was very primitive, and engineering was mainly running a transit and doing diamond drilling, the fact you had a small command and had it by yourself taught me one thing, and that is that make decisions when you're necessary. Don't wait for somebody else before you do something. From Nicaragua, I went to Cornell, and I think I've covered that. At the end of the first summer, I had fallen in love with Jackie. So I decided I wanted another year because she hadn't finished her trial teaching. So I put in for another year at Cornell, and they gave me a fellowship, which I was using as an argument with the Corps of Engineers to let me stay another year. They also, at that time, sent me a letter, please volunteer to go to U.S. Waterways Experiment Station in Vicksburg for the summer. They were giving a course, and I declined. But I got a letter back immediately, or a telegram, that if you expect your request to spend another year at Cornell to be approved, please volunteer immediately unless you have a cogent reason to go to Vicksburg.
Yes, well...
that was very fortunate. In fact, my whole career is a matter of luck and happenstance.
That's very interesting.
So I went down there and met, at that time, Lieutenant Vogel, later General Vogel, and finally headed the TVA after the war when he retired, and formed lifetime friendship with him. But first time I was there was just for the summer. Came back and spent another year at Cornell, married Jackie that winter. We then went back to Vicksburg for another tour. That was her first assignment in the Army. And the problem there was working on model work. In other words, it's first of my, you might say, my whole career has been spent on some type of technical work in which part of your problem is explaining to seniors who do not understand what it's all about.
Oh yes, that's very interesting.
And
it started early
at
in that.
the U.S. Waterways Experiment Station, why we would make a model of some problem area in the Mississippi River, either for flood control or navigation, for other river and harbor problems throughout the country. And many times we'd come up and find that the district engineer in charge had made a horrible blunder, and we would have to, we would always say, well, we don't know what is wrong. This is what the model says.
Oh, yes, that's a very tactful way to express it.
Like with General Ferguson, who was really a pioneer in creating a new policy for control of the Mississippi River. He believed in shortening it. In other words, his premise was if you want to drain a bathtub, make a bigger drain hole and let the water run out faster. See, at the time I first went down there under a different head of the Mississippi River Commission, the idea was maintain the length of the Mississippi. So millions were spent on trying to retain the Greenville bends, where they went round and round in big loops. Whereas General Ferguson's idea, was cut them and get the water down to the Gulf of Mexico as fast as you can.
And that was his method of flood control.
I know. I wasn't at the cutoff, but when you cut Leland Neck, one of the main cutoffs, once you did that, there's no way of changing the policy. And the chief of engineers were not too enthusiastic, but he did give Ferguson some leeway. But when he was cutting the neck, he got a telegram, as I understand it, the chief of engineers, do not cut Leland Neck without my specific written authority. So General Ferguson got the telegram, and he said, send back the message. I just cut Leland Neck. Please wire instructions as to how to stop it.
That was a wonderful reply.
But the point I'm making is my COs were people who did not worry about too much protocol in getting decisions. Vogel was in charge of the laboratory. He built it from scratch. He had been in Germany as a Freeman Scholar, and as a young lieutenant was put in charge of building this laboratory. And it was his bailiwick. As I say, I spent a year there. He convinced me that I should follow in his footsteps and become a hydraulic expert. And he helped me get a fellowship in Germany to go study European hydraulic research methods. I had quite a time getting it through the chief of engineers. I had 5 turndowns before I finally got approval. But finally, Jackie and I took off to spend a year in Germany. It was 1934. Hitler had just taken over, and he was consolidating his power. And it's rather interesting that the big purge, where he eliminated a lot of opponents, on June 30th, 1934, I have a letter unsigned, dated just a couple of days before that, awarding me a fellowship in Germany, which has a P.S. on it. Due to an unforeseen circumstance, Herr Dr. von Morsbach was unable to sign this letter, initialed by his secretary. But the interesting thing, they always honored it.
That's amazing.
And he wasn't killed. He went to a concentration camp and finally was released. I know I tried to get in touch with him to thank him, but he sent back word through friends that he'd come close enough. He wanted no contact with me or any other foreigner. He was out on his farm, and he planned to stay there.
Oh, yes.
But it was interesting to see that period in Germany's history. I mean, it's how Hitler gradually took over, swung the people behind him, as I say, for one reason or another. They were mainly, the biggest reason for most families was that they were afraid of communism.
Oh, yes.
And they recognized that there were certain evils in Hitler's form of government, but they felt it was the best for them at the time. And I always felt these so-called 92% votes really were 92% votes.
Oh, yes.
Because I found generally, as I say, people for one reason or another were for him.
Yes.
And saw no substitute for it.
Of course, also, Germany had gone through that frightful economic inflation.
That's right.
Which must have conditioned their minds.
It conditioned their mind. Now, the Jewish question started up. I know Jackie, we lived with a German family, so we could learn German. And I know the house, we call her Frau Professor, because she was the widow of a very distinguished professor at the University of Berlin. And she said, why do you go to this ice cream place across the street? Jack said, because it serves the best ice cream. She said, you know, it's Jewish. Yes, you may get a brick in your head someday going in there. But Jack said, well, but we'll continue to go because it's got good ice cream. Yeah. Well, the Hausfrau was Frau Professor was very interested in our learning about Germany. Every Sunday she'd take us on an excursion and show us some part of Berlin. She said, I don't want you to know only the bad parts that you read about in Time magazine as they come in here. Oh, yeah. So we had a very interesting time in Germany. At the end of my term there, I took a trip with 35 German students. I was the only foreigner. We visited the entire North Sea coast where they were reclaiming land, the same as Holland has done. And a German captain of engineers was along, and we inspected various fortifications they were building. And on some things, why the professor would say, now, seeing you're an American, like in Helgoland, you can't go on a trip with us because we don't want you to hear that we're violating the Versailles Treaty. But if you go up on top of the hill and look down and see where we go, I think you can put two and two together in deciding what the lecture's about without hearing it.
That was a very interesting remark.
But it was an experience. And again, watching how a man takes over. I know I was sometime called a Nazi when I got back because I said, well, if you leave Hitler alone and give him time, he will lick Europe. We'll have to fight him.
Yes, very prophetic.
But at the time, everyone thought he was a clown and did not have power, did not have the people behind him. But that history showed he... In fact, it's amazing the strength he showed in all of World War II. I think if he had withdrawn at the proper time, Germany probably would have ended in some kind of a stalemate that would have been more advantageous to Germany. But he was a fanatic, no question about it.
Yes, that was very interesting. One of the scientists I interviewed worked with Madame Curie, and she said, you ought to go to Germany to study. This was back in the 30s, the same time as you. And he said, well, I'm Jewish. And she said, well, Hitler has come to power and he uses the Jewish question only for political use. Yeah. But once he gets into power, he'll forget all about that.
That's right.
How wrong they were.
That's right, how wrong they were. Well, anyway, I went from, I was supposed to get a doctor of engineering at Hochschule, but I got caught on it. I think they call it the Manchu law, that you was to go to be with troops once every 3 years.
Oh, yes.
Can't be away from troops more than 3 years. So my pay would stop. And in those days, you didn't think of borrowing money to complete an education. And I had no other source of income except my second lieutenant's pay. So I wrote to Professor Dean Hollister in Cornell, and I thought I had arrangements to come back to Cornell for one summer to get a doctor's degree. But when I got back, I was reassigned to Vicksburg again, and to meet the Manchu business, I did extra duty with teaching reserve officers. But at Cornell, we ran into the red tape of a university, although Dean Hollister had promised me he wanted me to design a hydraulic laboratory for him, in addition to one that Professor Schroeder had on the gorge. But the dean of the graduate school took a different view. The last year in residence must be at Cornell.
Oh, yes.
He said, you come back and we'll help you get a fellowship. And I said, I'm already overeducated. I need to get more work with the Army. So anyway, I gave that up for the time being, went back to Vicksburg. I translated my thesis from German into English and started to peddle it. I found Mavis, Fred Mavis of State University, Iowa State. No, wait a minute, you have to get it right. State University of Iowa at Iowa City. Very receptive. He wanted a thesis. So I went to see him and really took my qualifying exam right then, because I said I want no more ifs or ands or reversal, and I actually had a letter signed by, I think it was 11 people, that if I spent 2 summers and registered absentee while I went to engineer school, that I would get a degree. I know it turned out to be a joke but every time I would show this letter on something I wasn't required to do, I finally got caught up on my own intrigue. When I finished the last summer school, I stopped into the graduate school office, the registrar, and said, send me the diploma. He said, we've never issued a doctor of philosophy, PhD, in absentia. You'll be here in cap and gown. He He said, you didn't have anything like that in your letter exempting you. Let's go look at it. He read it carefully, and he said, there's nothing like that in this letter, so you be here.
Well, so that was a definite end in writing.
That was a definite end of that writing. But anyway, I enjoyed going back. And I've been to engineer school where they teach you company tactics, and I was very late for that. While I was registered at Cornell, I completed more work on my thesis at the library, National Library, and Library of Congress in Washington. And they were quite proud. Well, actually won the Collinwood Prize in ASCE the year we had it. They published it for me.
Oh, yes.
So I then went to West Point after, and West Point actually paid for my second summer's tuition because they needed a concrete expert because they had a new concrete lab. So they said, can you work in course in concrete this last summer? If so, we'll pay your tuition and your expenses of going there. See, the previous summer had been on my own. So the deal I had with the university was that I'd already taken all the courses I needed to take, just take whatever I wanted. So so in my entire education, I paid for one summer school. That was the summer 1936.
Yes, well, that you've got
all the rest are paid by the government.
Wonderful education, which now takes about $100,000 to finance the.
Well, I've stressed that because I think, again, it's a matter of luck. I had no plan. Yeah. I just liked going to school. And Jackie was as interested as I was in going to a foreign country and studying. And so for reasons other than just a thirst for knowledge, I continued my education. My next assignment was as an instructor at West Point in engineering and military history. And I was quite interested in military history. At that time, the instructors would teach military history one day and engineering the next. So it was quite a load. But I was quite interested in it, and in the summer of '39, I wanted to visit the battlefields of Napoleon. I spent all over Europe visiting hydraulic laboratories, so we knew Europe, and Jackie wanted to go back, so we saved our money and borrowed money for a car because we shipped it over. In those days, you could ship one over for $100. And spent the summer '39 in Europe. And we were told to keep out of the West Wall and enter Germany through Switzerland, Luxembourg, and not Luxembourg, but a little, I forget the name of the little province there. It's separate.
Liechtenstein. Or
Liechtenstein.
Several other
But
small
anyway, we
countries.
went in that way so we'd avoid going through their fortifications. Yeah. And I know the military attaché had asked me, he said, now don't make notes of this. You've got a good memory, but I want to check on which way the Germans are shipping supplies. He said, they have these black trucks. He said, you can tell when they're loaded by looking at the springs. So you keep a rough count as you come up to Berlin and everywhere else you are in the country, and then report to me verbally on how many are going east and how many are going west. He said, I'm trying to figure out whether they're going to attack first the east or they're going to hit Belgium and France. Well, my count was the same as everybody else. A big load was moving toward the east, so the Germans definitely, but they were running an awful lot of trucks both ways, and so to try to confuse the issue. And so that was interesting. I mean, and we would join Germans in beer halls and sit with them, and were amazed at the change in tone of the German conversation. Before, everything was peace. Hitler's for peace. Oh, yeah. Now, there's no question, there's going to be war. Why do you want to interfere with it? Why don't you just sit and watch us take what we need?
Yeah, that's interesting. That must
a complete change.
A
complete change.
Rapidly.
I know we went back to visit the Frau Professor, and she was so pleased. She said, I thought with all the word of war that you would never come see us again. And I said, no. I said, we had a very pleasant year with you, and we did want to see you. But then we went out through Belgium, and of course I had Jackie at various places looking for what preparations were. the military attaché in France had told me it'd be, as long as I got back and sailed before the 31st of August, I'd get home okay. But don't plan on staying much longer, because war was going to start.
That's essentially the guns of August.
That's right. But anyway, they had, in Holland in particular, every bridge was mined, ready to explode. They had necklaces around the trees to block them, drop them down the road. And then we went to Metz, because I had a letter from the librarian at West Point, who was a friend of the commander at Metz. He was in charge of that sector, the National Line, that had a big bend in it, at the end of it also. And he had told the librarian that if he sent over a young engineer officer, he would let him go through the Maginot Line, but not to make any reference to anybody else, but just appear in his office. So I did that, and when he discovered that Jackie was French, why, he wanted her to go through too. But I said, no, I don't think that'd be good. I was afraid they might cut back on what they would show me. But anyway, I was the first officer in the American Army to go through the fort out in front of Metz. And it was very interesting. But when I got back to Paris, I told the military attaché that I wanted to write a report in the Maginot Line, and would he give me the information he had on maps and things, because I did not have any maps. I knew where we'd been, the names of certain places, and I could piece together just where that fort was that I'd been in if I had good maps. He said, how'd you get in the Maginot Line? I told him. He said, well, I've been trying for 2 years to get somebody in there. And so after I said, well, I'll send the report through you, he was very cooperative.
Oh, yes. That's very interesting.
It was rather interesting because after about 41, I guess it was, or 40, when Germany sliced through France, when they finally got through with Poland and Czechoslovakia, and finally attacked France, we had the military attaché was in U.S., our military attaché to Germany, and he was accused of being too pro-Nazi because he was preaching that when Germany finally struck, well, it'd be like a hot knife going through butter. And so the newspapers got after him. So to have him speak at West Point, I had to schedule a lecture, and mine was be on the Maginot Line, and have it in the evening, and so it would not appear on any bulletin board that he was coming to West Point. Anyway, he came to the house, and he went over we had the lecture for the first class. So he gave the lecture on how the Germans were going to slice right through, come through the Ardennes, and would have no problem whatsoever in licking France. Next day, I gave the lecture on that they would never take a fort in the Maginot Line.
Oh, yes.
We both turned out to be correct.
That's right. That's right. They didn't go through.
They attacked one fort, but no fort fell until after the Germans had occupied Paris.
Oh, yes.
And then, of course, France was so licked by that time but a few forts the Germans made a point of attacking up near the Alsace-Lorraine, up in that end of it, and did take one fort, but it was after the fall of Paris.
That's very interesting.
Then I guess that's enough on West Point. By 41, when I was finished, it was obvious we were going to have war. Normally, an instructor in the course of engineering and history was rewarded by being sent to Leavenworth, not to prison, but to the Army General Staff College. But they said, due to the imminence of war, why we would get military assignments. My first one was a mapping outfit, which my friend in Washington, Chief of Personnel, thought I would like because he knew I liked independent commands. So I had to go see him, and I said, I don't want to be busy with mapping. If a war's coming, I want a combat outfit. So I got him changed the thing to the 36 Engineers, which in World War I was one of the first engineer units to go into combat. So I thought, well, this is a good one. And so he changed the orders. And after I got the new orders, Colonel J.C. Marshall, who had been one of my instructors in engineering when I was a cadet, came to West Point and said that he wanted me to build the Rome Air Depot. It was one of the first assignments the Corps of Engineers had for building, taking over the Air Corps building. They were just disgruntled with the Quartermaster Corps and wanted the Corps of Engineers to do military building. We never done that before. Quartermaster Corps had always done military building in the zone of interior. Engineers would do construction in the theater of operation. And of course, we had River and Harbor to train us in engineering for during peacetime. So he said if I would agree to it, he said Bill Bessel had said that he would not change my orders unless I personally agreed. But Marshall convinced me that the war was still far enough away that I could spend a year on the Rome Air Depot. I'd be that's Rome, New York. I'd be in charge of the project. He'd not interfere. He would give me my choice of personnel out of his personnel, and I could then go to a combat unit after 1 year. He wanted me to organize it, get it started, and so I accepted that, called Bill Bessel and said, change my orders. I ended up at the Rome Air Depot, and that was quite a challenge because it meant starting the whole thing, acquiring the land, all the problems you have with a town, Rome, New York, with the people and getting water supply and that type of thing. One interesting thing came up that regard to how things change in Washington. The Russians were holding in November of 1941, and I had bought a right-of-way and I found later that General Arnold had issued an order that no one was to buy any land, not even a single acre, without his written authority. So I was supposed to go to Washington and be bawled out by General Arnold for having violated orders and buying land. But it was rather interesting. I told his aide, an engineer officer, that I had in my pocket enough bills of lading to show that I already had saved more in freight than what the land had cost me. And if Arnold could say whatever he wanted to, but I was going to insist on telling him it was good judgment and I'd already saved him money. Yeah. Well, he said, he went in and he came out and he said, well, General Arnold's busy today. Go home and I'll send for you next week. Well, that Sunday, Pearl Harbor occurred. Well, I heard no more from General Arnold.
Yes, I imagine nothing. There were other things that had more priority.
And right after that, I started. By that time, the Quartermaster Corps construction, which is then under General Somerville and General Groves, Colonel Groves at that time. Those two had been transferred to try to rescue it. They'd been transferred to Corps of Engineers. So I was then assigned the Pennsylvania Ordnance Works, a new TNT plant. And so at the time of the Manhattan District, well, I had both, building the Rome Air Depot and Pennsylvania Ordnance Works, and I was commuting back and forth. Jackie and I had moved from Rome to Williamsport. And on a Sunday, I think it was June 19th, 1942, I got a call from Marshall, that's Colonel Marshall, requesting I be in Syracuse headquarters Sunday morning at 10 a.m. So I can't tell you over the telephone. What for? So I appeared. I drove 100 miles to get there and arrived a little before 10. He was sitting there at the end of a table and he said, I've just been assigned a new technical project. He said, it's very, very important. The development project that may end the war. You have 15 seconds to volunteer or be drafted.
That's a nice way of putting it.
So I'd had that type of thing before, volunteering. So I said, well, under those circumstances, I volunteer. Well, that, again, was just luck. Now, he had asked General Steyer, who had been one that assigned him the project, if he could have me for another year. He knew I was supposed to be released at that time to go overseas. And Steyer reluctantly agreed to it. He says, well, Nichols had promised that he could go overseas, or go to a combat unit when he had about a year's construction work. But he argued that Marshall told Steyer that he felt I would be of benefit in dealing with a scientist having a degree, a doctor's degree. So Steyer said, okay, you can have him for a year. So I found myself in the Manhattan Project. I had the right qualifications. By luck, I was in the right place.
That was a very interesting combination there.
That was very interesting to where that was the argument for being. And of course, after I got into it, well, I lost most of my desire to go fight because I figured that this was a more intriguing work. And during the war, I think you know as well as I do, Clarence, that the Army's job was to coordinate the whole business. We had the best people in the world, I mean, the best scientific organization you could get. Bush and Conant had put it together and under the OSRD and under the leadership of Compton, Lawrence, and Urey, and several others at Fermi. So it was really an outfit which our main job was to give them their head and let them do their job, but to coordinate it with the industrial contractors who would be building the plants and operating them.
Yes. Now this, the Manhattan Project was formed about early in 1942 then?
June. In other words, I think the Sunday was June 20. Marshall was up there on the 19th. That's when he called me in Washington. And Bush and Conant had decided that the time was ready for construction. And Conant recommended not that the Corps of Engineers had charge of it, but that an officer in the Corps of Engineers be put in charge of construction of the plants.
Oh, yeah.
Nothing was said about operation, but just construction. And they had the report to President, I think, I put dates in June, which outlined to President Roosevelt what they wanted to do and that the Army should be involved in construction. So the result of that was approved by the President. Of course, there had been the earlier contacts, which other people can tell you better than I about Wigner and Szilard contacting Einstein and getting a letter to the President that set up the original research. But I got into it as a decision was made that building should start. And as I say, I was lucky to be at the right spot at the right time.
Yes, well, of course, that was immediately. There hadn't been much time elapsed either between research and development and the decision.
Of course, as we got into it, we found that they were far from being ready to construct anything. So I know as Jackie says when reading my diary of where all I went the first 2 or 3 weeks is fantastic as to places we went and got things started. Like I know on 1st of July we were down at Oak Ridge, not Oak Ridge, but where Oak Ridge now is, seeking a site. Colonel Marshall and Blair and I were down with Representative Stone and Webster to select a site. And I left from there to go to Chicago, where we acquired the land in the Argonne Forest Preserve. In other words, we sewed that up while I was there. We designed the laboratories he wanted. I mean, made sketches of them, and Stone and Webster was given the finished plans. I mean, where they could start building immediately. But we thought we had unlimited authority. Like I have a letter from Colonel Marshall stating you have unlimited contract authority. Well, of course, when the chief of engineers saw that, he said, well, that's Steyer, but you'll find eventually that'll be limited.
Oh, yes.
But anyway, we went on the premise that we could do anything that was legal.
Yeah.
In other words, we didn't have to worry about regulations. We did have to worry about legality. So our main job then was to find contractors. And I think it's interesting, a story that's been given some publicity but not enough. Compton, of course, was in charge of plutonium at the Met Lab, formed the Met Lab. And after Stone and Webster first started working with him, but he decided that Stone and Webster did not have the qualifications to do the chemical end of the job. So he talked to me, and we went to DuPont to work out a deal whereby they would furnish men to Compton and ultimately take over the design of a plant for the chemical separation after you had the reactor built and operating. DuPont, though, very skeptical. I know.
You spoke to Crawford Greenwald at that time?
No, at that time our contacts. See, I had contacts there as a result of building the Pennsylvania Ordnance Works.
Oh yes.
Because they were the designer of the Pennsylvania Ordnance Works, so
yes.
I knew the people. And I'm trying to think of their chief of research development, but anyway, chief engineers. But they came to me shortly after we had signed a letter of intent. And that letter of intent had disappeared because it was superseded. But I know they said, Nichols, we thought you were a friend of DuPont, that you'd worked with us, a very friendly relationship. But you and Compton sure hoodwinked us on this one. The material doesn't even exist.
Oh, yes, well.
Seaborgs, I think, had microgram.
Yeah, it existed. They had microgram of it at that time.
But as far as DuPont was concerned, the material didn't exist. So they wanted to review the whole project. Well, Groves and Conant compromised on that one to where they were allowed to review the chemical end of the plutonium. And later they got, again, apprehensive. See, DuPont was very much worried about a failure. And they had been so criticized after World War I that they were leaning over backwards and not getting into something where they could be accused of a boondoggle. And later, a few other questions came up in chemistry, and they insisted then on reviewing the entire project. Well, I brought it up to Groves and Conant, and they decided, well, you couldn't let DuPont review it, but you could set up a committee, essentially DuPont.
Yeah.
So, what's the name of the man in MIT?
Bush?
Chemical engineer, I'll think of it later. And Eager Murphy were the outside DuPont people. And with the chairman from MIT, the professor, chemistry professor there, headed this committee. And they reviewed the entire project. And of course, Compton and Fermi pulled a really classic surprise by on their way back from, they'd gone to Chicago and then went out to see Lawrence Electromagnetic, and on the way back, why, he had ready to start the first chain reaction in the stadium, about 4 days ahead of time. I was trying to be there 4 days later.
Oh, yes.
But they worked nights and day, I think, to get the thing ready. And they brought Greenwald in to observe the first chain reaction. Well, I think that helped sell DuPont. In other words, you're over the hump on the critical experiment.
Oh, yes.
And then the same committee, informally, gave us a blueprint of how we should do all the rest, because they said, we feel there must be no failures in this project, or the whole thing will be condemned if we don't get it done before the war. And so they gave us a list of people, a type of contractors we should have, like Eastman Kodak, for the fine chemistry required in 235 in the electromagnetic plant. Tennessee Eastman eventually was the one that did the operation there. But I remember going with Compton and Groves to Wilmington, and the meeting at which we were to get the answer, would DuPont continue and take over the responsibility for the whole business? And I was always interested in Stein, our chief scientist, I believe he was at the time, a resume of the whole business. As I recall his words, he said that you have about a 50-50 chance that this project might be successful. But far less than that it'll be successful in time to have any effect on this war. He said the time scale is such that the war is very apt to be over before we, Compton had outlined a time scale which DuPont had tentatively agreed to. Well, Groves tried to push him up. The result was all Stein said, instead of that schedule, we push it back by 6 months. And you really want to have a schedule that we may be able to meet. But he then went on to say that DuPont had no business being in it. I mean, as far as their financial and future interests were concerned. But at the same time, I don't know of any company that can do a job the equivalent of what DuPont could do on this. And he says, if it fails, why, we're going to suffer. But he said, I think, as a citizen, they should do it.
Oh, yeah, that's a very interesting point of view there.
And Groves then worked with the top management, and about 2 days later, why, they came through with, they would take on responsibility, but boy, did they have provisions they wanted in the contract. So it fell to my lot to negotiate the contract, because at that time, in 42 and 43, I was deputy district engineer, and the project I was following was finding the ore, working with Ruhoff to get the feed material plants built, with Compton on the plutonium project, and the heavy water plants up the one we were building initially was up in Canada. So that was my end of the project, and although I did have a deputy district engineer access and went out to visit Lawrence and found out that he was probably more ready to work than anybody, go to work building than anybody else. But so it fell to my lot to coordinate DuPont and Chicago. And that presented problems, because the Chicago scientists felt they could design the plant and we would build it, and there's practically a revolution at one point. I forget the exact date, but I know Compton said, I would have to sit at the round table and listen to them. There were so many complaints. Well, I remember Fermi listing the grievances. DuPont was too conservative. They were too safety conscious. They just took forever checking on items. And if they could do the work, Chicago could do the work in about 1/2 the time or less. He finally ended up with a comment. He said, if you and the Army will just buy all the supplies, the bricks and the steel, and get them out to Hanford, I'll show you how to build it. He said, we don't need DuPont.
That was a very naive
it amazed me that because I had tremendous respect for Fermi. He's probably one of the real outstanding geniuses on the project. But he was so wrought up with the delays and conservatism of DuPont, he felt action had to be taken. I know I went back with Hilberry and Compton to Compton's office, and Compton said, sometimes, he said, I'm inclined to agree with Fermi. He said, if we only had somebody who could build all the roads and the waterworks, I think I'd try it. And I said to A.H., I said, well, A.H., I'm an expert in hydraulics. I've built water plants. I've built the Rome Air Depot. I know all about how laying concrete and building roads and water. Let's do it. At that, he started to laugh.
Yes. Well, that shows.
Maybe we better stick with DuPont. But it was it's like taking candy from a child. In other words, it was their baby. Mm-hmm. And here DuPont was insisting on control, and they even got to the point where in Hanford, where no one could go from the Met Lab to Hanford without Groves or my written consent.
Oh yes, it's got to be
because DuPont,
much of a controversy.
DuPont did not want the scientists interfering with engineering and construction. They wanted their help, but no control.
Yes,
and that caused a lot of trouble, and it also caused DuPont a lot of worry, because they felt for the first time on any project they had to rely on another group to furnish them knowledge that they did not possess in order to have a successful project. So it fell to my lot, and also Conus and Groves, to how do you pacify and keep a working relationship? Because absolutely essential that you maintain the group in being until the very end of the project. And this thing flared up several other times. And Compton, though, was really remarkable in holding control of them and keeping all the scientists working, in other words, their nose to the grindstone on getting their end of the job done. And I know DuPont would call me every now and then and say, well, Nichols, you have to go out to Chicago and put down a revolt out there, like when, first started with a helium reactor, then went to a water reactor, and then Chicago scientists wanted to go to heavy water.
Oh, yes.
And I know Roger Williams called me and said, Nichols, we got another one.
Yeah.
I said, what's that? He said, well, Chicago, they're agitating we should, for the second reactor, instead of building a duplicate, we should shift to heavy water. You have to decide with Groves, do you want production or do you want to advance the art?
Yeah. Well, at that particular time, it probably would not have been possible to produce that much heavy water.
Oh no, we've had it under production.
Yeah, I know, but there was a tremendous amount.
Oh, I know it, but it would have been. But we could have done it.
Could have done it,
but it would have delayed things.
Oh yes.
So I know I went out to do what I could to, and also confirm that we were backing DuPont, that we wanted production.
Yeah.
In other words, the reactors would be essentially duplicates instead of advancing the art, which we agreed with, but said let's do that after the war. So it was that type of thing that came up. Now, I've always felt that DuPont's conservatism, though, really paid off. It's illustrated best with after we got the reactors going, first one going at Hanford, it suddenly died due to xenon poisoning.
Oh, yes.
And, of course, that was unexplained. Fermi dashed out to find out I guess he was there. But then started calling for certain research, and it was found, of course, somebody had miscalculated the cross-section of the xenon. What number of it is?
Yeah, well, the cross-section of xenon turned out to be about 25,000, and they said, well, as long as it's not greater than 10,000, we're all right.
Yeah.
It was, unfortunately.
And, of course, we'd had the same type of argument when DuPont decided instead of putting 1,500 tubes in the reactor, they put in 2,000. I know I was called in on that one.
Oh, yes.
Fermi felt and Wigner felt that DuPont did not have confidence in them. There was a question of showing a lack of confidence in scientists. And, well, Roger Williams called me and said, well, Nichols, as an engineer, we never built anything without a big factor of safety.
Yeah.
We believe they're right, but we want a factor of safety. Well, those extra 500 tubes saved the day.
Yes. Without that extra moderator and fuel, you couldn't. It
would have been a failure.
Would have
been very difficult to correct if they'd built them according. But that just illustrated, to my mind, the essence of the project was that you needed every type of talent, and you had to find a way to make them work together.
Yeah, so that was a marvelous illustration.
Now the other one where of course, the electromagnetic plant. Ernest Lawrence had such a grasp of the subject and also had little experience in building things that he probably was the best scientific leader as far as working with a contractor was concerned, and had very little trouble with Stone and Webster. A gaseous diffusion plant was another thing. There we, due to trying to avoid having two Columbia people on the S1 committee, Urey was put in charge of heavy water plus the gaseous diffusion plant. John Dunning was the advocate of it.
Oh, yeah.
John Dunning had the same optimism and aggressiveness that Ernest Lawrence had, but he didn't have the prestige to get the following. And so Urey was put in charge of it, and Harold Urey never really liked it. I know it finally came to the point where we were having trouble with a barrier. And before going into the Urey complex, I think it's necessary to review that we had spent over $100 million on plants to produce equipment and at Oak Ridge before we had a suitable barrier.
Yes.
And we had the unfortunate business of calling in the British to help us, and they're coming up with a finding that we couldn't possibly complete the plant in time to be of any value in World War II. So we finally lessened that verbal recommendation by telling, I think Bush took care of that, by telling Chadwick that the British shouldn't be judging what American industry could do in regard to putting out pumps and diffusion units, that type of thing.
Yes.
But our barrier remained the real problem. And I know at one point we were worried about the performance, and I remember one S1 committee meeting where it just whined all over. Who should be in charge of research and development? Nobody had the confidence to say John Dunning. Some people said, well, Dobie Keith should take over research and development. And others said, well, no, Uri should continue. But they realized we had a problem there. I know I went to see Uri in Fackenthal and finally agreed that he should remain in charge of the project. It probably was a mistake. His heart wasn't in it. And when we really the going got tough, Uri wrote this letter to Groves, in which in effect he said, you spend $100 million, there isn't a chance of success. You should stop wasting money and cancel the project or go over to the British method. They say they can do it cheaper.
Yes.
Well, that's where they're tough, you know, when you're spending without real anybody checking on you, hundreds of millions of dollars, and your top scientist on the project says it's a failure. Well, we decided he had to go and send him to England to look for something. In the meantime, brought in Curie from National Carbon, I think it was.
Yes.
To take over, and I believe Dean Pegram told Uri that that was an accomplished fact, that Uri could remain in his office, have full access to everything, but he was no longer in charge of the project. Well, I remember seeing Harold on the train after that, and he said, Nichols, he said, I've never been so relieved in my life.
He wasn't angry, in other words.
No, he wasn't angry. He was relieved, because it was our mistake. We insisted too long that he should stay on. We wanted a Nobel Prize winner.
Surely.
And
you had a Nobel Prize winner at each one of the others.
And but we didn't have theirs.
Yeah.
But Dobie Keith, and then the other thing was, the result was there's really no key guy that could be in charge, be the leader in the whole project. Now, Dobie Keith probably ended up as being the real leader.
Yes.
Dunning was good on solving his end of the problems, but on the barrier, why, it took carbide getting into it, and Bell Telephone Labs, and finally a young fellow in Dobie Keith Kelleck's laboratory came up with the answer.
Yes. Well, that was that solution to the barrier problem was a wonderful thing.
But the same way, like DuPont was designing and constructing and operating Hanford, where we dealt with one company for the gaseous diffusion plant. We had a mixture of Columbia University, other universities, and different people in charge of different barriers, and Dobie Keith at Kelleck's for design. We had J.A. Jones for operation, and we had Union Carbide for
operation.
Yeah, operation.
Yes.
J.A. Jones for construction. And then we brought in Ford Bacon Davis to run inspection and to build the conditioning plant. Yeah. So we had a multitude of contractors. And it fell to my lot because after August of 1943, I became district engineer. I remember one time going to Lyman Bliss and saying, I'm spending 90% of my time on trying to coordinate all parts of the gaseous diffusion plant. He said, the only mistake you're making is you're not spending 100%. He said, if that fails, the whole project fails. So I did have to spend a terrific amount of time trying to coordinate all very qualified people to keep them on the same objective. And speaking of objectives, I think it should be mentioned that our success was due to the fact that throughout the project we had one single objective, as to make an atomic bomb that would fit in the bomb bay of a B-29 bomber at the earliest possible date.
Such as July 1945.
Yeah, such as July 1945. Of course, the other crisis we had was when we discovered that you could not use plutonium in the gun-type weapon, which from the standpoint of DuPont was concerned in Hanford, it meant we could cut the size of the project if we could succeed in using the implosion method. But we had no assurance that the implosion method would work. Up to that time, it looked like the first bomb would be a plutonium bomb if you used a gun-type weapon. Yeah. But once we fired from that, you had to practically double Los Alamos to develop the implosion weapon, and also it became necessary to have a test, because no one felt that you could move from you might say, scientific design to the battlefield.
Yeah.
You had to test it first. Whereas a gun-type weapon, they felt confident in that it would work with a U-235. So it ended up almost a draw. I know the final push in May, I had to predict the Groves because he was promising Stimson when we would have weapons.
Yeah.
I said we will ship enough to 235 from Oak Ridge to have a weapon August 1st. And I know I bet Tennessee Eastman people, McNally and Conklin, 6 bottles of whiskey that he couldn't make the schedules. He would work with them on the schedule. And I bet him, I said, Groves says you can't do it. Well, they got in the betting mood, so I said, okay, I'll cover this for Groves. That's 6 bottles of whiskey. So I told Groves, I said, well, I made this bet in your name. He said, why in your name? I said, well, they would prefer to take it away from you than from me. I said, besides, I will probably enjoy drinking some of it.
Yes. Well, in order to make that, because I was down there, we swept out practically every microgram and milligram from every possible place you could find U-235 in the whole plant in order to get that.
I told McNally, I said, scrape the bottom of the barrel.
Yes.
This date is critical. And we had 2 different quantities. You ever see the bet? We had 2 different quantities.
No.
As to how many bottles of whiskey he won, see, on 2 different schedules of so much by a certain date and so much more another date, 2 days later.
Yes.
But they made it, and I enjoyed drinking it with some of the scotch. But anyway, we gave that prediction to Stimson, and I know Groves said, you'd better be right on this one.
Yes.
But I think the overall, the real significance to me was the privilege of working with the talent we had in the Manhattan Project. As no man was responsible for the whole business. It was teamwork that was required. And it's amazing how well everybody worked together, sometimes grumbling. But never did I know of any occasion where difference of opinion caused a loss of time. In other words,
well, this is a marvelous story, how with all of those very complex objectives, with all of the complex people that you had and all the material problems, supply of ore and...
Well, we were lucky on ore.
Yes.
See, after the start, right at the very beginning, Groves was in it then, but Marshall and Conant more or less suggested to me, well, I ought to dig into that. And I know we were lucky because we found that Sanjay, who is from Union Miniere and African Metal, had sent over to the U.S. 1,200 tons of 65% U-235 because he didn't want to fall in the hands of Germany. And I know I got rumors of that. The Finletter called me, State Department, because somebody had asked to ship some of it to Canada. And so I went to see Sanjay. It was rather interesting because I was in civilian clothes. And I said came there because Finletter said that he had uranium. I said, I came to buy it. And he said, do you have any authority? He said, you're in civilian clothes. I said, well, I'm a lieutenant colonel in the Army. He said, well, you insist on giving him some identification to prove that. And he said, what authority do you have? And I said, sure, I have more authority than you have uranium to sell. But anyway, we sat down, and he said, you don't need to tell me what you're doing. He said, I don't think you would. But he said, I have a pretty good idea. And he said, I'm willing to sell it to you. We outlined on the yellow pad, the terms of the sale of so much immediately, to put all he had in an Army depot for safekeeping, and to give us the price and estimate of shipping all above ground from Belgian Congo. Well, that basically was our supply of U-235 that we needed to produce the bombs we used. Now, it filled the pipeline. Now, it wouldn't have been enough to continue operation indefinitely, but it assured us that we were building plants that we'd have the material available. And that was all solved. I think I saw him on about September 22nd or so of 1942. Now, it took us about a month or so to work out the contract and that type of detail, but that gave us the supply of uranium we needed. We were lucky.
That was, of course, a fantastic coincidence, because that was that 1,200 tons, as you say, was enough to fill the pipeline to assure operations, and luckily happened to be in the United States.
And I think it was 65% material. You know, their waste pile was 20% material.
Oh, yes. That's fantastic.
It's really fantastic.
Yes,
at the Shikalobi mine.
Where now we find a pretty good deposit is 0.3% in ore.
Well, anyway, it all ended up, of course, at Alamogordo, a successful test of plutonium bomb, and the Indianapolis taking part of the 235 to Tinian, and the last part flown. Plutonium was all flown, and the 235 working over Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the plutonium bomb. Now, there was a third one available to go, and but on that I have a copy of the Groves letter to Stimson, which has Marshall's comment on it, not to be used without the specific written authority of the President of the United States.
Oh, yeah.
So after the first two were authorized, and on the decision, of course, to use it, that's been criticized, but to my mind, there was a never more thorough going over of whether or not you should use the weapon than what was given to the atomic weapon, the Hiroshima bomb. And, of course, you had all the scientists, not all, but many of the scientists at Chicago, primarily under the leadership of Dillard and Frank, who were protesting the use of it. And I was always interested in Kay Tracy, Compton's secretary, informing me one time, and she says, you know, the people who are against using it have no one in the Pacific. She said, I have a loved one there.
Oh, yeah. It makes quite a difference in the mental attitude.
So she stirred up a counter agitation. In other words, when Compton finally presented it to me, I think it was, I don't know the exact dates, but I think it was August 24th, when is Compton going to come through with his count of where the scientists stand? So I went to see Compton's Oak Ridge. So I went to see him, and he had it all there, and he said, well, I can give it all to you tomorrow. And I remember I told Groves what the results were, which really favored essentially what we were doing. In other words, to drop it on 2 bombs and get the reaction. And I know as I phoned into Groves on the scrambler what the results were, he said, well, where does Compton stand? So I said, A.H., where do you stand on this? You haven't indicated what your vote is. He said, what's yours, Nick? I said, well, of course, being in the Army, we wouldn't build this thing unless we're planning to use it. And I have a lot of friends that have lost their lives in the Japanese theater. I don't want any more. I said, so we use it to the best advantage of the military to end the war. And he thought for a while, and I said, well, I guess that because he put it in his book, he reviewed all his Mennonite ancestors and the problem of conditioning yourself, the idea of attacking a city with it. But he said he also remembered the people he had advised to go into the military, and his friends of his he knew that would be involved, and the loss of life that would occur if we had to invade Japan. He said, so I'm with the majority.
Well, that's very interesting.
But there's no question that it was something to be decided, but Stimson set up this interim committee to review it. Oppenheimer, Lawrence, Fermi, and Compton were on a scientific committee to give advice on it. They had their chance to present whatever they wanted to, and Stimson made the decision and recommended it to Truman. And of course, at the same time, that's what people forget, Truman approved the invasion of Japan, to be scheduled for November 1. And most people, I have a lot of friends who have written me notes on that well, in fact, this little girl that interviewed me on Channel 7 during the 40th anniversary TV parade, she said her father always told her that she wouldn't have ever been born if it hadn't been for the atomic bomb. He was scheduled for part of the attack.
Yes.
And he said he doubted if he'd lived through it. He'd been through Okinawa. And when you consider the cost of Okinawa, why, Japan would have been much worse.
Yes, well, of course, I think this
So
has
anybody
come out,
that had a responsibility, I have yet to find that worried about the decision being made as what. But people who could sit aside and be, you might say, please their more inner desires and their conscience, see, would have preferred to hesitate. But they didn't have the responsibility of making the decision.
Of course, there's also another point about that. If we had decided not to use it, that probably would have been policy as far as even research and development on this after the war. And about 1949 or 50, with the Russians having their espionage so
I always said if
they would have had a bomb.
If we hadn't used it or hadn't completed in time to use, I probably would have spent my time explaining the $2 billion been spent. That would have been my career.
Oh, yes.
And Russia would have analyzed the results and gone ahead and then sprung it on us as a surprise.
Oh, yes. And that's one point that most people don't.
And I don't think you ever would have had the public realization of the effects of atomic weapons if that actually hadn't been used.
That's right. It's one thing to theorize about it.
Or even to see a test like Alamogordo.
Yes. That's quite different.
To where, well, that was, of course, the conclusion of the scientific committee, was they could not think of a demonstration that'd be adequate to convince the Japanese. Like I know the first bomb I saw go off at Bikini, from 15 miles, it looks like nothing. Now it's closer for the underwater shot. And there, of course, you had greater effect, greater radioactivity, and it looked more impressive. But a lot of people see after the first shot where they missed the target, where they say, oh, the atomic weapons are not too important.
Yes. Well, that's very at the point which many people do not realize.
That's right.
What the outcome of history would have been without this.
I hesitate to even try to say what it might have been.
Yes. Well,
but it certainly would not have been to our advantage if we had not used it. Well, going on, of course, I had the job of turning over the Manhattan District to the AEC. They refused to have any responsibility for it, even though they were appointed, I think, in October, until January 1, 1947. So we had to continue with the Manhattan District without real good authority or directives, although we did go up for appropriation. As I mentioned earlier to you, we actually had appropriation for two more regional laboratories in the U.S. Now, the idea of regional laboratories, or what they now call national, really was generated by, I think, Compton and Charlie Thomas. I know we got delayed one time at Oak Ridge, at Knoxville, where a plane was grounded, and they came back to have lunch at our house, and they took the time to figure that had me captive there, where it convinced me that we should have regional laboratories to carry on the work after the war. And I know I said, well, what we have to do now is to convince Groves and make him think it's his idea. And so we've set up a plan as how we're going to do that. Of course, later one time when I told A.V. Peterson, who had been in charge of our contact with MetLab, or the area there, well, that's funny, because he said, I had the same conversation with Charlie Thomas and Arthur Compton. We decided, well, how would we get you in the right mood to where we could convince you that we should have regional laboratories? But that's the way things happen in government.
Oh, yeah.
And you have to give the boss credit if you want his support. But I always agreed with Groves when I told him that story.
Oh, that's a marvelous story there. And so that is essentially the origin of the...
Well, I've been up to Chicago, and of course we had quite a time with carrying on some work. Groves limited to what would be helped during the war, because we could not see our way free to spend much money on post-war benefits. In other words, the war was going on. We were going in debt. People still worried about going in debt in those days.
Oh, yes, that's right. And,
but I'm glad they originated that idea, and it's been a good solution over the years.
That's right. They've been very productive in general.
course, after Bikini, I was informed by Lilienthal and that I was not to be director of military application, although the job had been written in Congress about me around me.
Okay.
But I didn't mind that too much because in the meantime I had received an offer of being appointed professor of mechanics at West Point. And I thought the war was over. In other words, there's not going to be any more war, so although I was disappointed that Lilienthal took the attitude he did, but I think we would have had great difficulty getting along together.
Oh, yeah.
My ideas are so diametrically opposite to what he stood for. But anyway, I went happily up to West Point with the idea of staying there 20 years, because you could stay on to age 65, and then the rest of the Army, you could only stay on to 64, and you might be retired earlier. And a wonderful place to raise 2 kids. But that was not to be, and in fact, the first year I was there, I was away 200 days. Because as part of the deal, why I had to be available to the Joint Congressional Committee as a consultant, to the Army staff, and to the Military Liaison Committee, and also to the AEC, but they never consulted me.
Oh, yes. Well, that really kept you busy.
Oh, in other words, I kept informed, and then when Groves left, why, I was yanked out of West Point, or ordered to Washington, and promoted to a major general and to take over Groves' Armed Forces Special Weapons Project and an Army position on the Military Liaison Committee. And then I had a very interesting time in going from, you might say, no action, because everything slowed down except the production of official material. 235 is the only thing that increased. Yeah. But weapon research slowed down, and there wasn't the incentive. Everybody thought, well, we're through with wars. Yeah. And so as the Cold War developed, well, just typical of how it happened, I mean, I was called into conference, I believe it was April 30th, maybe wrong on that date. Clay had sent a letter to the staff stating that he'd never thought so before, but he thought war was now imminent, judging by the actions of the Russians.
Oh, yes. See, what year was that now?
That was 1940, 48.
48, yes, that's right.
I was there. I just come in. My promotion was held up, I think, by the Lilienthal. He didn't want me back in the business. So Bradley said, "Can you go over and take over the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, even though you haven't been promoted?" I said, "I have no problem. They're all friends of mine. As long as they think I'm going to be promoted, there'll be no problem." But I mean, I attended these meetings with Forrestal and the top. And that day, after a few days after I was Royal called me and he says, "Come over to my office." He was Secretary of the Army. And I was told to wait in the ante room, and then he came out and we went to an elevator, went down the elevator and got into a car. He said, why are we going? I said, "Well, Mr. Secretary, I don't know why we're going, because I don't even know where we are going. I was just told to come over to your office." "You know, we're going over to the White House. I thought you'd know why." Well, Harry Truman was there waiting for us. Lilienthal was there. He put the two of us in chairs in front of his desk. And he started off with, "I know you two hate each other's guts."
That's a typical Truman opening.
That's right. But I mean, he was a guy that believed in action.
Oh, yes.
And he said, "Nichols, if I prove your promotion to a major general and you take over the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, and if I tell Mr. Lilienthal his primary objective is to develop better weapons and produce them, would you have any problem getting along with Mr. Lilienthal?" I said, "Not if those are the guidelines."
That's very interesting.
And he said, "Well, Dave," he said, I'm going to sign Nichols' promotion, and I expect you two to get along with each other."
Rather direct orders.
Rather direct orders. He then excused Royal and me, and he said, "Dave, I have a few more." Oh, he had one other comment, which I always thought was good. He said, "Dave, you'll have to forego your desire to put a bottle of milk on every doorstep. You have to start building weapons."
Yes. Fine. Well, that's a very interesting comment.
But it showed Truman.
How he worked.
Yes. course, I stayed on all through the period up to 50 with atomic job in atomic energy. And the Korean War, we finally broke down the custody problem, which is the main issue I had with Lilienthal. When I held out that the custody of weapons should be in the military, not the AEC. And that was the main issue between Lilienthal and myself. And that was solved when Korea broke. And we had to move weapons around, including some to Britain, as we didn't move the official material at first, but just to have everything there. And at that time, another thing came up, which again I was in the same position of interpreting to bosses and the top a new art and science. And I had been asked when Pace we got the hydrogen bomb approved, without it going through regular channels. It was one of these things that's done. I know I appeared before the Joint Chiefs of Staff and arguing they were going to be asked the next day that where the position was when it got into a controversy in Congress. And I've helped carry the ball for the military side of the hydrogen bomb decision. And I don't need to go into all that. I mean, that's history, but it was quite a struggle.
Yeah, so that, and of course, Truman
again made the right decision. I know it was rather interesting when that was going on. I got a call one Saturday from McMahon, who I tangled with also with custody. And he invited me over for breakfast. This was in October of 49, after the Russian bomb. And I didn't know why he wanted me, but I went over there and I found a few people from the AEC, all of his staff, a couple from state. And I sat in the back, not knowing what it was all about. And finally, he started in on the hydrogen bomb, the importance of making a decision. And I saw one of his staff walk up and give him a note. He said, "Yes, I know General Nichols is here. I invited him. I think on this issue we'll be on the same side."
Oh, yes. Very interesting.
But that is really the fact. He was on the side of a hydrogen bomb, I think, was a big influence on Truman.
Yes.
Because of all the letters I've seen written at the time, his letter was the best argument for countering the General Advisory Committee.
Yes,
argument, why not?
Yeah, some people expected him to be on the other side.
I know it. Well, considering some of the things he'd been for before, you would expect that.
Yeah.
But he announced right then and there, he said, "This is one thing I think Nichols and I are going to be on the same side." So I know he talked to me several times after that, how to get the Joint Chiefs online and to where it would go through. But he was really one of the top politicians, the political effect of deciding, well, this has to be done. But with Korea, by that time we had expansion of production.
Oh, yeah.
The hydrogen bomb underway. And I had got involved with Frank Pace when I called in with him one day because they were trying to get the record straight as to who all had been in favor of the hydrogen bomb.
Oh, yes.
And he said to me, "Well, Nichols, don't you think we should, instead of spending $1 billion on the hydrogen bomb, we should be spending a couple $100 million on the Nike missile for air defense?" And I said, "I don't like to put it instead of." I said, "I'm all for the hydrogen bomb, spending whatever is necessary. However, I also think we should be spending whatever it takes to develop an air defense against the atomic weapon, hydrogen weapon." He said, "Why haven't you recommended it?" I said, "Well, it's not my bailiwick." I said, "I'm not in charge of missiles. I'm not have nothing to do with air defense. My job is how do you get more and better atomic weapons and hydrogen weapons. And I think I'm doing fairly well on that." He said, "Yes, you are." But he said, "Well, you think about it." He said, "You ought to." Then Finletter sent for me. And he said, "How do we set up a Manhattan Project for missiles? To get aggressive missiles, offensive missiles, and also defense." He said, what would we require? So I started outlining the authority Groves had. He said, why do you need all that? And I said, that's the way we got the job done. I said, we can't, to get a job done, but I said, even though you would say you could give the same authority to some individual, I don't think you could do it in time of peace. I said, the Manhattan Project type of structure would not work in time of peace. Well, that was the last I heard of that. Oh, no, he said, well, think about it. Well, then the next I heard was K.T. Keller, who I knew quite well from his wartime production of the big cans for the diffusion plant. He came to see me. He said, just left Truman's office. And Truman had asked him to take over and be, in the Secretary of Defense office, be director of guided missiles. And as he said, make some sense out of the program. He said, I told Mr. Truman that I would do it provided you were my deputy. And he says Truman's answer was that he would not order me to do anything. He didn't believe in doing that because you have to go through channels. He said Nichols done an important job. Secretary of Defense involved in it, so is the Army, and so is he. If you can talk him into it, why, maybe you can have him. Well, anyway, he talked me into it. And so we had a good time, again, working with real talent, but there was a race of specifications. If the Army came up with a missile, a ground-to-air missile, why the Navy would come up with one that would outdo it. Same with air-to-air. If an Air Force missile would be able to fire a mile, why the Navy had one 2 miles. Just a race of specifications. So I told KT that I would work for him on 2 conditions. One, that he would never see anybody in Washington or anywhere else in regard to missiles without my being present. He was only going to be part-time. He's still chairman of the board at Chrysler. I said, I've seen too many advisors come in here and have some Army officer working for him, and all he hears is, well, at lunch today, somebody tell him, lunch today I met with your boss and he agreed to this.
Yes, that type of thing.
I said, I won't have any part of that. And then I said, in addition, I want you set up in a position to where any time they don't carry out your recommendation, that you resign. He said, I'm ahead of you on that.
Well, that's very interesting.
So I was asked to write the charter. Yeah. And I know my friends, either atomic business, were involved in this too, so I came up with a charter where he had absolutely no authority. And they said, Nick, what kind of a game is this? We thought we'd have to fight with you on what authority you had, and the only authority Keller has is he can order you to do things, and you were ordered to carry out his requests. But I said, where's the authority? I said, oh, it's very simple. As the Secretary of Defense had just issued an order that no money will be spent for production of any guided missiles without the specific written authority of the Secretary of Defense. I said, you can't beat that, because any time the Secretary of Defense doesn't okay Truman's recommendation, he's through.
Oh, yeah. Very simple arrangement.
Very simple arrangement. So, and then I also told KT, keep your contact with the President. He said, I will. I'm working for the President. I'm not working for the Secretary of Defense. So every time we'd have a group of missiles ready to go into production, we operated with a staff of 6. So we'd go out in the field and work it over with a contractor and the Army or Navy or Air, whichever contract it was, as to what the program should be for production. Then we would come back and tell the Navy, if it's a Navy missile, well, if you recommend the following, we will okay it. So we'd make them recommend what we were willing to okay. We would assemble several programs like that. I would call the White House and ask for an appointment with the President when Keller was going to be President. We'd go see Harry Truman, and my name was Mud because we always stayed an hour instead of 15 minutes. And Keller would brief Truman on what we were doing, and Truman said, I'm glad you're at work, keep it up. Then he'd start asking Keller questions about everything else. Keller, of course, Republican, Truman, a Democrat, but he admired Keller and admired his advice. Then we'd go to Secretary of Defense. getting too long?
No, this is perfect.
Then we go to Secretary of Defense and give him the same program, and love it. It was usually handled even when Marshall was there, and then later he became Secretary of Defense. He'd say, well, Nichols, draw up the necessary letters for my signature. And I'd draft the letters authorizing the program, and that was it. Very simple procedure.
Very effective.
Very effective. We had one revolt one time. The Navy revolted on one and wrote a letter saying they wanted to know why he limited the production of a certain number, that they felt ought to be more. I know when KT came, I handed it to him, and I said, KT, if you answer this letter, we're in the paper mill.
Yes, that go on forever.
Go on forever, I said.
Yes,
and he said, well, he said, let me handle it.
Mm-hmm.
So we had our usual meeting with the Army, Navy, Air people staff and my staff, and I think it was Admiral Duke, I'm not sure, might have been Savvy Side, but whoever was the aide to me at that time, Keller said, I have this letter from your Chief of Naval Operations. What does he want? Doesn't he agree with our program? Well, anyway, the Navy said, well, he doesn't exactly disagree, he just wants your reasons. And Keller said, I won't discuss anything in writing. If he wants to discuss this with me, call him on the telephone, I'll go up there, or he can come down here. We can discuss it, but I'll not answer the letter. He said, he wants it in writing. And, of course, he didn't. It was the Navy staff that wanted it in writing. They got the Chief of Naval Operations to sign it. But anyway, Keller at that point, he said, I not only won't answer it, I won't even receive it. Here, take it back.
Very interesting.
2 days later, a letter came through with a program that we were willing to approve.
Oh, yes. All right, let's see.
But it worked.
Yes. Now, what year was that again for orientation?
That was, I was on guided missiles from, actually November 1950 or January 51. I'd had two jobs during the interval. Until 53.
Oh, yes.
Now, then, of course, during that time, of course, Ike was elected president.
Yes.
And Charlie Wilson was designated as Secretary of Defense.
Oh, yes.
So Keller said to me, he said, well, this will never work with Charlie Wilson. And so apparently Ike called Keller and asked him at least continue. And, to where we don't have it look as though you're leaving because Charlie Wilson was appointed. So I know the first time we went through the rigmarole again, we didn't go over to see Eisenhower because Keller didn't have the same relationship with him. But we went direct to Wilson, and Wilson apparently had been warned at how he did. He said, well, now, Nichols, what do we do next? I said, well, at this point, I normally would write letters for your approval, your signature, and I've already done so. Here they are. And you would approve them. You would sign them. And he said to KT, well, do you mind if I think about it a little bit? Well, Keller says, oh, that's all right. I'm going down to Florida fishing. And he says, tell Nichols when you've approved them, when you've signed them, and he will let me know. And he said, I expect to hear within a week.
Yeah, that's very direct and blunt.
So at the end of a week, I called Wilson's aide and said, well, I need to call Keller today to tell him what the status is. So he waited, well, let me see the secretary. Well, about half an hour later, he said, well, come up here. So I went up to see Charlie Wilson, and he said, you see, I signed him. I said, yes, that's fine. Now I'll probably go ahead with it now. But he said, why? He said, I started checking into this. He said, there are a lot of people who don't agree with these letters. I said, I know it. But I said, that was the purpose of Keller, to resolve these differences, make a decision, and proceed, get some action. I said, now if you want to go back to I said, what he's doing is your work. If you want to go back to the old system and write letters back and forth with all the arguments pro and con, well, that's okay, but I don't think Keller will have any part of it.
Well, that's...
And so he said, well, I'm worried about it. Well, he continued to... Keller laughed. He said, well, Charlie Wilson never in his life ever approved anything without getting into it.
Yes, well, that's very, very interesting. And,
But then I had been appointed in '52. I had made a study of how to do research and development in the Army at the request of Pace. And I came up with a recommendation, and then Pace called Keller and said, will you let Nichols take on his additional duty being Chief of Research and Development in the Army? Okay. So the opponents of the plan said they would agree to it, provided I was Chief R&D, like Tom Larkin in G4. He knew me, I'd known him down in Vicksburg, and I talked to him about the change. And he said, well, I could make it work, but he wouldn't agree to anybody else, so I was Chief R&D as additional duty.
Oh, yes.
Well, that solved a lot of things, because Keller said, well, that's fine, because now whenever I want to leave, you've got a job, I can just pull out and we'll cancel. We'll just close up the guided missile office, which we did in October of 1953.
Oh, yeah.
And in the meantime, of course, Louis Strauss came in, and he started approaching me in July, before he was named, I think, chairman of the AEC. Would I come over as general manager? And I said, well, Louis, I'm having a fine time in the military. Very successful career. I'm the youngest major general in the Army. I've been ever since 1948, and still am. And I'm happy where I am. But if I'm told that I have to go, in other words, I said, I won't volunteer, but I won't oppose an order to come over. So I just went to Ridgeway, and I said, well, to give him the situation, I said, well, I think Ike Lewis has consulted the president, but I don't know for sure. But I said, I will do what I'm told. Perfectly happy where I am as Chief R&D. But if I'm told to go over there, I had to retire, which is quite a decision. But anyway, that was a decision, as Charlie Wilson didn't think that I should go not because he didn't want to spare me, but because he didn't think I had the capabilities of being general manager, although I'd been district engineer the whole distance.
Well, that's
But anyway, that's how I got to be on the AEC.
Yeah.
Well, of course, I got mixed up in, of course, one of the conditions I have at Lewis was that Ike would be okay declassifying enough material to where we could go ahead with commercial development of atomic power.
Oh, yes.
And that we'd have to get a congressional act. That would be, I said, I'm not going over there just to make weapons. I want to develop a peacetime use of commercial power. Well, he assured me that he had cleared that with Eisenhower, and that that would be one of the considerations that we'd go ahead with. But I finally got somewhat disgusted with the work I had to do. First, the Oppenheimer case.
Yeah, so that intervened there.
That intervened. See, that happened. Yes. I arrived on November 1st, and that broke loose on December 2nd.
Yeah.
And then there was a Dixon Yates.
Yes. Yeah.
Which lasted until I left.
Yeah.
But in the fall of '54, I told Lewis that come about 6 months from then, I was going to leave. I said, I didn't get into this business just to argue with Congress and be in politics. And he said, well, maybe I can talk you out of it. Don't tell anybody. Well, in February, I said, well, I put it in writing. Well, then all hell broke loose because, the commission said, why didn't you tell us that Nichols was going to leave? Well, anyway, I left May 1.
Yes.
But I enjoyed the AEC work. Of course, from a strictly financial point of view, I had to stay with it for 8 years, to combine my retirement.
Oh, yes.
With my military retirement in order to make it worthwhile.
Oh, yes.
Otherwise, I was without a good retirement.
Yes.
And I just decided I was not going to put up with it for 8 years at a political level.
Yes.
So I decided I would get out and go into working with industry as a consultant.
Oh, yes. Well,
but I did enjoy. I think we accomplished a lot when I was general manager. I know on getting along with the military, that was Ike's objective, to bring me over where improved relationships for the military. And of course, we immediately continued, or I continued my contacts with everybody in the military. So did Lewis with the Navy.
Yeah.
So we bypassed the Military Liaison Committee on a lot of issues by just going over to see Admiral Radford.
Oh, yes.
And settling it, and then stretching it out.